Hello there, friends. On today's interview, I have the chance to speak with fiery Irishman living abroad in Japan, as well as IDW critic Chris Kavanagh. As I always like to espouse, I think it's important to look at different perspectives and views in order to sort of sharpen what it is we believe, what we think about the world, and whatnot. So I like to speak with people who are on the more critical side of things I might tend to sympathize with. So I decided it might be a good idea to chat with Chris. Things have been a little bit heated recently. I did this video with him about 2 weeks ago, but I think it still stands. The things that are said are an important side to look at and perspective, and I am curious as to what you all think about it. So without further ado, here is my interview with Chris. Yeah, so I want to kind of discuss your area of expertise / also talk about the original reason why I wanted to have you on. You critique the IDW folk / anti-SJW folk. I want to get to that, but I was telling you earlier how I was looking at your pinned tweet, and which is a thread of you talking about the work you're doing in Japan on rituals, and I thought that was way more interesting. So I want to first start off talking about that, and I think we can connect it. So, so you're specializing in ritual in Japan. So if we could just talk about like where you're teaching and I guess how you got those appointments and how you came to be interested in ritual.
Sure. So I have a dual appointment, which is I'm an associate professor of psychology in Rikyo University in Tokyo. And prior to that, my PhD was in anthropology, kind of the cognitive anthropology area, and now I have a dual appointment where I teach psychology at Rikyo, and my research is with the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology in Oxford.
Right.
So I do the research for ritual mainly for that appointment, and teach psychology at the university in Tokyo.
Okay, but you're studying, so you are studying like the Japanese ritual or ritual behavior for your appointment at Oxford?
Yes, mainly. So
okay.
I started out in kind of study of religions and social anthropology area, and then moved to cognitive anthropology and kind of more quantitative approaches. And then I was always interested in doing research on Japan culturally and socially, but when I started studying about religion and ritual, Japan is a really useful environment for examining those kind of topics, because you have a country where there is a lot of ritual, there's a lot of temples and shrines and festivals, but unlike the West or even like the Middle East or most other places, you have a lot of rituals, but you don't have a lot of kind of strong belief or identification as a religious person. So it's this nice separation, or quite unique separation, of a lot of ritual and not a lot of strong religious identity.
Okay, so can we talk a little bit about what? So I think people have a good idea. Most listening would have a good idea of what religiosity looks like in the West, even if they're not practicing. So go to church on Sunday, celebrate Easter, Christmas. You can culturally, you can. But wait, actually, you mentioned about being Catholic, from a Catholic background, and you did mention that there is a bit of a ritual feeling there.
Yes.
So can we compare that a bit with Japan and the similarities?
Yes, I think so. I was raised Catholic. I'm not like a believing Catholic, but
right.
I think Darryl Bryan, the comedian, said that being a strong atheist just makes you a bad Catholic. And that's,
Okay.
I think that's the way my parents would see it. So,
Okay.
yeah, I went, to mass every week until I was 18, and still when I go back at Christmas or whatever, I'd go to mass. So Catholicism and like Irish Catholicism was part of my upbringing, and that was kind of what you suggested when I was learning about when I was doing study of religion as my undergraduate. There was this critique that researchers brought these assumptions that were associated with Protestant Christianity, that there should be there should be doctrinal knowledge and a personal relationship with God, and that you should people should have a kind of understanding of why they are doing things themselves.
Okay.
But as Catholics know, or have experienced, there's quite a lot of ritual aspects where the point is the ritual.
Right.
It's not necessarily knowing what all of the individual aspects mean, and the important thing is doing the ritual, going to mass or saying the prayer.
Right.
So I find the kind of a lot of the things in East Asian religions or in kind of different areas that just weren't associated with monotheism, that the ritualistic aspect seems quite familiar with me, that it's fine for people to do rituals and not understand what they mean.
Right.
Because,
Right.
I'm not throwing shade on Catholics, but at least in my experience, lots of people are not that interested in interrogating what the deep theological meaning is of the specific rituals. They just do it. And that's normal.
Right. So those are sort of points in Western Christianity / religion / I guess specifically Catholicism that relates to, that you can see as a similarity to the ritual that you can find in, I guess, Eastern religions, but you're specifically focusing on Japan. So, but that's a good, I think, touching off point for people in the West to sort of have a visual, like, oh, okay, I even if, like, I'm Protestant, but I've heard of Mass and I have heard of confession, and I mean, I actually have I have a degree in Christian studies and a minor in Christian history, so I do know a lot of that stuff, but I know virtually nothing about Japanese ritual. So that's a good idea, I think, to relate that over. And I mean, I didn't come up with it. I saw it on your thread. You mentioned it to someone. So,
Yeah.
but that's good to kind of relate that over. So the biggest difference between, I guess, Western Protestant sort of belief versus Eastern ritual, is it orthodoxy versus orthopraxy? Is that what you said?
Yes, that's something I emphasize. Some people probably would disagree, but
Okay.
I think it's a meaningful distinction that traditions which are focused more on practical ritual performance, belief is still there because you have systems with deities and giving blessings and karma or all these things, but the important thing is the practice and the more so than the belief, versus orthodoxic religion, where it is very focused on what you believe and what the correct doctrinal interpretation is. Placing an emphasis on belief. So I think that distinction is useful, but it's, if you take it too far and imagine that no one in Japan cares anything about belief, and all of the people in the West don't have any, they want to know what every element of every ritual means. No, it's like a continuum. But there's still, when you look at the two kind of systems or groupings of traditions, I think you can see a clear distinction between the two of them. And so it's a useful framework, but it's not like a hard dichotomy.
Right. Yeah, I think that I liked the stats that you gave about the wording of question about religion. versus the way that they sort of just altered the phrasing a little bit. Can you go into that a little bit, explaining how at first glance, looking at these sort of, I guess they were worded by Westerners, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know who worded them, but they were worded poorly to get the result and produced kind of a look of a sort of atheist state, but it's not really. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so a lot of the questions in like large cross-cultural surveys about religion and belief tend to ask if people believe in God or identify as Christian, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever the tradition may be. And in Japan and some other Asian countries as well, the association with like believing in God specifically is usually associated with the kind of Christian concept of like a creator God, or the Christian God specifically. So if you ask that, because people are not usually talking about that kind of thing, they assume that you're interested in, are they Christian, or do they believe in the Christian God? And if you ask them about their identity, like most people in Japan do not have a very clear self-identified identity as a specific religious group. So when someone dies, they will find out which temple their household is affiliated with, because that's the temple that will do the service for the deceased. And that is often the point where people find out which Buddhist sect they're technically, affiliated with. But even setting that aside, there is no prescription to not attend Shinto festivals or to not have a Christian themed wedding, there's much less of an emphasis on exclusive devotion to a specific tradition. And where there is that devotion to a specific tradition, it tends to be either Christian converts or people who belong to new religious movements, or who are quite devout people. So ordinary people will not really strongly self-identify as religious. If you force them to, they will probably say Buddhist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have very strong Orthodox Buddhist beliefs.
Right.
Just that's the closest kind of identity that comes to mind, because that's where funerals will be, or blessings. But that doesn't fit so well with the kind of the system in the US or the UK or Europe in general, where people see religions as fundamentally exclusive, even if there's connections, and that it wouldn't make sense for, apart from a New Age person, to be attending a mosque and then going to a church and then like having a Shinto wedding or that kind of thing. But that's completely unremarkable here. And I have a good example of the distinction. So there was an American professor who visited the lab when I was based in Hokkaido in northern Japan, and we took him out to see these kind of traditional houses. They have this kind of museum of old houses of Japan in a park, and in one of the buildings there were a Buddhist altar for deceased relatives, and there was a Shinto shrine, Kamidana and Butsudan, they're called. And these are quite common things in old houses. You won't find them in modern apartments in Tokyo usually, but in traditional homes in the countryside, you'll usually have both. And the American researcher, who was a quite famous psychologist, was saying, what's that? What's this? So we explained, oh, that's a Buddhist altar, or that's a Shinto shrine. And then he was like, but both in the same house. And then, like, there isn't a clear distinction. And he found this very, strange. And then he asked the Japanese researcher who was with us, a guy called Shuhei, so do you have these in your house? And Shuhei said, no, but my parents do, back in our home. And then he said, okay, so which one do you believe is correct? And Shuhei, thought, because he hadn't really thought about this very clearly before. And then he was like, maybe none of them. And then the researcher was kind of surprised and said, what? And he said, oh, okay, well, maybe both.
So he's
probably.
like, you didn't like my answer, so I'll neither, but both, whatever you want.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, but yeah, that maps quite neatly onto the issue with the questions that, it tries to force the system in Japan into this monotheistic exclusive framework. And that's not how it functions. And people aren't thinking so much about that there is a contradiction. So, and it isn't because they're just not self-reflective, or that kind of that kind of contradiction never occurs. It's more that there isn't a clear contradiction in the systems.
Really? It's both and for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's called, is it syncretism?
Syncretism is the kind of mixing of traditions, and Japan definitely has syncretic, like mixture between Buddhism and Shinto traditions.
Right.
And actually, when it became less common because they were kind of officially separated during pretty sure it was during the Meiji, when the government, became more nationalistic and wanted to promote the Japanese things, and Buddhism was actually seen as the kind of foreign religion for them from China.
Okay.
But prior to that period, and I think historically there was a separation as well, but it was quite common for shrines and temples to be combined. And for the Buddhist priests would say that the Shinto deities were enshrined in the temple so that they could learn Buddhism. So they were kind of incorporated within the system. And these kind of shrine temple complexes still exist. So I did some research on an island in Miyajima Island, it's called, and there was a shrine inside the Buddhist temple. So the arrangement still persists, but it's just not so common anymore.
Okay. Why is it not common anymore?
Because the government...
because the government didn't like it, and it's still like that?
So no, after, all restrictions any restrictions kind of towards promoting Shintoism as the official religion went away when World War II ended.
Right.
But even when the government did have a lot of control and, officially they were separate, you can't undo hundreds of years of overlap so easily.
Right.
So it still remained in some places, and there's still the kind of intuitive overlap in a lot of the functions, and they're complementary systems in a lot of the way that they function in Japan. There's a phrase like born Shinto, die Buddhist, because lots of the rituals from birth are at Shinto shrines, and lots of the rituals all funeral rituals are associated with Buddhism.
Oh, okay. So I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, and actually maybe this is what you're trying to answer in your research. I don't know, but why is it so different from us? Like, for me, I want to know why. I want to ask the questions that researcher friend of yours that was there. Say, well, wait, why do you not question if you believe both or none? Like, I want to know. Like, my natural Western mind wants to dissect it, to be like, what do I believe? But why are we so different then?
Well, I don't know that it necessarily is because people are that different. I think it's more to do with that if you come from a Christian or monotheistic background, like with Abrahamic religions, Islam or Judaism or Christianity, that colors what you see as the default for religion. Religion is like this. It's like the things I know. But there's plenty of the world where that wasn't the dominant history.
Right.
So trying to work out, so why isn't it like what our baseline assumption is? Because Christianity wasn't the baseline assumption all over the world, or or any of the Abrahamic religions. So in countries where Buddhism was dominant, or Hinduism, all the different varieties, the kind of baseline assumptions often don't fit the Christian model.
Mm-hmm.
But teasing out, why, it's hard, because it isn't like you can say, well, all of the countries started with Christianity and then they diverged in these interesting ways. No, they all had kind of different systems emphasizing different things. And it isn't the case that like Buddhism and Shintoism, like I'm also aware of, all the anthropologists that will be shouting that these things aren't real coherent traditions. They're multiple traditions and interacting and Western kind of implied constructs that, but setting that aside.
We'll move those voices away for the purposes of this podcast.
Yeah. My social anthropology background is always like pinging at the back of my mind saying, no, don't say that. But it isn't the case that there's been no conflict between like Shinto traditions and Buddhist traditions, or different indigenous movements in the history of Japan. There's been prohibitions against one or the other, and not just in recent history. And there's been rulers who advocate like specific sects, and the sects compete. And so it makes it hard to speak with like sweeping generalities, because at times in history there's things that are very similar. And a good example is there's a sect of Buddhism called Pure Land Buddhism, which is a very big sect in Japan and like across East Asia. And the traditional kind of Western concept of Buddhism is that it's tried to say, oh, it's a philosophy, not a religion, and they don't really have the supernatural beliefs, and generally that is only true of the Western concept of Buddhism.
Okay.
That's not the case like throughout history or in most Buddhist countries. It very much is a religion. Of course, it has philosophical aspects, but so does Christianity or Islam or any of the major traditions. But this Pure Land tradition, the focus is on accepting the kind of promise of Amida Buddha. I'm pretty sure I got this right. Amida Buddha's promise to save all sentient life by having them be reborn in a Pure Land. So the thought is, this world is too corrupt. We're in the kind of end stage. You can't reach enlightenment here. You have to be reborn in the Pure Land to get there. And for that to happen, you have to have faith in Amida's promise and kind of recite these mantras or the start of sutras. And that will increase your merit, and you'll be reborn in a kind of heavenly land where all you can focus on doing is learning the like Buddhist law and then become enlightened. So that's a very salvation focused concept about faith and belief.
Yeah, the faith.
Yeah, and that's not the way people think about Buddhism. But it's a major Buddhist tradition.
Right. Why do it? Okay, it feels to me kind of okay. You can tell me what the real answer is, but I'm going to venture a guess. I wonder if the West's view of Buddhism is a sort of atheistic-ish sort of, we like the meditation and the thought, because I'm sure there is philosophy in Buddhism, it just isn't all that it is, and we like to have the thought but not, and the meditation, and then get rid of, there's tons of gods in Buddhism, right?
Yeah, yes.
I know this from watching like anime. Like that's why I know.
No, well,
like,
that's not a bad source in many respects for,
and like
getting.
demons, like demons and stuff, and like the gods combat the demons. Anyway, yeah.
No, you're completely right. The pop culture in Japan reflects the like supernatural world that,
Right.
is in the kind of traditional religions, and which is why, in certain respects, calling it an atheist country, it can be very misleading. But you asked at the start, if there were connections between, or that there might be connections between my work or research on East Asian religions and the kind of critiques I have of the intellectual dark web and general conspiracy theorists online.
Yeah.
And one connection that I do see is, so I initially went to a university in London called SOAS, School of Oriental and African Studies.
Okay.
And I was in part motivated because of an interest in Buddhism, a personal interest in, kind of it as a system of philosophy, or the stereotypical Western view that you would imagine when you hear someone say they're interested in Buddhism. Right?
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah. But when I went to the university, and I actually took a gap year and traveled around. But during that year, I made a choice between going to study law and at university, or do study of religions at SOAS, this like slightly weird university with like far left leanings.
Okay.
And traveling for a year made me decide, okay, the good thing to do with my life would be to focus on the like study of religion rather than the lucrative law career. But when I started then, my image of Buddhism, I'd read a lot about Buddhism from kind of Western sources, and I part of the thing I did for the gap year was travel around all these meditation centers, a bit like, Sam Harris's story, except I didn't have a trust fund where, I wigged out for, a number of years and traveled around India. I was just in America and Canada for a year, like traveling around. But anyway, so I had some experience with, meditation practice and all this, and was interested in Buddhism. Then I went to university and started studying like the history of Buddhism and East Asian cultures, and I very quickly realized that like my image was a fantasy that was, and not just a fantasy that was built on, ignorance, but rather an image that was particularly marketed to Western people in order to sell Buddhism, in a sense, as a modern religion. And there were good motives for that, because there was the Christian missionaries were trying to import Christianity,
right.
and part of this was a pushback from Buddhist countries to kind of say, no, we are modern too, or actually maybe we are more modern than you. Right?
You can be an atheist too. Like you can come on, join us. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is you have these kind of guys who are proselytizing Buddhism in the West, and in their English language correspondence, their promotional, they're talking about Buddhism in a very specific way. But then when they go back to talk to their domestic internal audience, they speak in a very different way, often very sectarian, and they're promoting their particular sect's version of Buddhism as this is the correct view of Buddhism, and it had a really big impact. Like it still is the dominant view that Buddhism is not a religion, it's a philosophy and all these things. And so the part of connecting that to the IDW criticism and all that is that I had this nice comforting image about, and maybe like a self-serving image. Oh, I'm interested in something a bit unique, and something that gives you I don't know, like a self-satisfied feeling. But then I had my illusions shattered, and I found the actual traditions and the kind of the history and the complexity much more interesting and much less simple than what I had initially set out to find. And it made me very kind of aware that we should look critically at the things that we assume, especially if they're comforting and self-serving images that we have. And
Okay.
yeah.
So you're
So
like,
I mean,
I see why you're doing it. Okay, I can see why you're like,
it might be a stretch.
No, it's not a stretch. No, it just clicked. So you've been through the valley of the blissful ignorance being kind of shattered, and so you find a responsibility to look back and be like, no, it's not as simple as you're making it seem.
Yes, I mean, I think my general stance, even in my academic writing and stuff, is just it's not that simple. That's a fair, summary.
Right.
Or there's like monocausal explanations don't work very well, but I would say that even before that experience with the kind of study of religion stuff was and the image of Buddhism being shattered, I was already interested in skepticism and science and those kind of like critical approaches. So it wasn't that before that I was completely on board with anti-vaccine narratives and
Yeah.
I already had an interest in like science and skepticism, but the experience at university still had a significant impact that okay, even with those kind of interests you can make big mistakes in reasoning and completely understandable because why would you question if you'd read a bunch of books about popular treatments of Buddhism? You might think that you're well informed about a topic. Same way, if you read lots of intellectual dark web books, I think it's not like that's not giving you any information,
Right.
but I think it's giving you a very kind of partial image.
It's a perspective. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. And but I can see how people can read, like 5 or 6, of these books, like talking about critical thinking and the need for like good faith arguments and all this. And then their view is, I get all that, and I'm able to apply that. And like, in my experience, even the people extolling those virtues are far from able to apply it regularly. So,
oh well,
yeah.
practicing what you preach is a hard thing, sir. well,
Yes. Yeah.
it is so hard. Like it's not even I fall short. We all do, but it's a sort of willingness to hear critique and criticism. Mind you, I know these individuals have so much flying at them that it's hard to be like, who is good faith criticism? But what I'm getting from you, and it's kind of going back to your original connection, was you need to look at things from many perspectives. You need to look at things from the original source. You need to look at them from how others view it. You need to kind of just look at how all the different perspectives that you can are really important. Like, look at criticism, look at people, look at the pros, look at people who are their, their followers, look at the people who are their antagonists, and then make your decision.
And a lot of this to me is, so when people see me criticize the, people in the intellectual dark web or right-wing people in general, they often assume that like my worldview is like they see anthropologist in my Twitter bio, and then they say, oh, he's a woke anthropologist who, just, of course he wouldn't believe this. And I mean, Sam Harris kind of went off in his podcast on that assumption when based on like an interaction we had.
Wow.
But I get why people would think that, but my background was, like I said, I was in social anthropology, but I left social anthropology to go to more quantitative cognitive anthropology, which social anthropologists generally see as like the devil, or not an appropriate way to approach the issues. So social anthropologists in general don't like my field very much. And I left the social anthropology field in part because I didn't like the amount of the things which which the so-called squared people are complaining about, in a sense that there's a dominant paradigm that the general problem is neoliberal globalization, and that not I wouldn't, postmodern neo-Marxism or whatever. I don't think that's the best way to frame it. But certainly there is, a focus on Foucault and power relations and that. And it wasn't that I found that was all wrong. I just felt kind of that the critique they make about it being not all there is to say is correct. Now, so I left and joined, the kind of cognitive anthropology, and now in social psychology area. But when people see criticisms, they assume that it's coming from, an ideological critical theory background. And I've written articles that are quite critical of critical theory. So the kind of baseline assumption is wrong, that the motivation is just, this kind of tribal policing of academic borders, or it's more that the kind of thinking that I see embodied there is to me very similar, as I've been waffling on about on Twitter, to the critiques that I had about conspiracy theorists or alternative medicine movements. And a lot of the things that I learned from academia, but also just from skepticism, or looking at things from different perspectives, leads me to be very critical of the narratives and the techniques that the folks of the intellectual dark web and their
cohorts,
their cohorts are pushing, because it feels to me that they aren't doing that. And so maybe again I lost my breath, but basically just to say that I completely agree with you that you have to look at it from different angles, and that this was the point I wanted to make. So the hyper focus that you should never consider the context of guilt by association, who someone talks to is irrelevant, and it's just like way to besmirch someone's name, that they would be willing to talk to people. If you only talk to people that agree with you, how will you ever learn, and this kind of thing. That to me is always missing the point. Not always, because like people do that, but there's no reason that you can't consider that information alongside considering someone's argument, alongside looking at the evidence that they presented and technically critiquing it. But contextual information isn't irrelevant. And when I hear the people who complain about that kind of thing, or complain about mind reading on podcasts, they engage in that completely themselves.
It's the blind
they just
spot.
Don't recognize. Yeah. They talk about motivations and why people are doing these things, and what are they lacking in their life that makes them interested in wokeism or this kind of thing. But they don't see that as mind reading. And to me, it looks very, very similar, but one is just not called mind reading, or so it's, people often respond when I'm talking about, the context of this person was, like, say, Eric Weinstein promoting Cernovich recently, and saying, well, he's just sharing, information and so on. Why don't you take apart like the specifics of what they're sharing? But the credibility of Cernovich matters, because his identity is, a conspiracy theorist who doesn't do good research, who is ideologically motivated, and in general is just pushing out self-aggrandizing conspiracies. So that context matters. If someone says, well, look at this guy's take, this is a good source for,
Right.
during a pandemic.
Right. So it does matter. Yeah, it's kind of taking it case by case, taking in all the facts and making decisions where maybe, I guess it's hard because it feels like it's cherry picking, like, well, we'll take this one and it's okay if they have the guilt by association, but we won't hold the guilt by association to that one. It does feel like, oh, I don't know if I want to do that. But then, but you have to sometimes make judgment calls for particular situations.
Well, I actually think you have to be consistent. So you apply it.
Oh, so wait, that's the opposite of what I thought it was a case. So it's not good to have a case by case?
No, I think that so in my case, for example, if I see someone interview someone, right, like that, say interview Stefan Molyneux. Okay, my immediate thought is kind of like, that is likely a bad decision, right? Because of what he puts out. But what people say in those interviews and what they say afterwards, that matters.
Yeah.
So people always say, that, oh, there's no nuance to the, criticisms. They just see this person spoke to that person, and that's all that matters. But there's plenty of people, for example, that Sam Harris has interviewed, who, like Dia Khan, right, who interacts with extremists relatively frequently, and interacted with Sam Harris, right, and she's quite relatively, far to the left, but she didn't afterwards get slammed as, oh, you're enabling Sam Harris, or the historian who talked about, white nationalism. So I don't think it's the case that it's just, if you ever speak to people, that's all that matters. What matters is what you said, and yes, it matters the patterns of the people that you engage with regularly. If your guests are Sargon of Akkad, Cernovich, Stefan Molyneux, it's not non-diagnostic information of what your worldview is likely to be. But it still does matter what you say. I just think that those standards are applied inconsistently, not just by critics of the intellectual dark web, but by them themselves. And my general hang-up with that whole group as a collective is that they are inconsistently applying standards in a hypocritical manner. That's the that and the conspiracy mongering are the two things that annoy me the most.
I have actually just been thinking about this just in general in my own life. The only thing is, and I mean, you could answer ways to curb this. Are we not all hypocrites at one time or another?
Sure. And we're all biased, and we're all subject to, like in-group pressures and conformity biases and availability heuristics. There's nobody that isn't susceptible to those things. But what doesn't follow from that, admitting that, is that therefore everyone is equally taking steps to avoid that influencing what they do. And it's one thing to be aware of that and another to try and take steps to combat that. And it's like, I don't think anybody should reasonably claim that they're always, hyper rational. They never engage in things which are group dynamics, or they don't feel any peer pressure. If you think that, you're wrong. You do have those biases, and they affect what you do. But I often see a lot of people appeal to that as if acknowledging that everybody has biases and that these affect things, that means that everybody is just doing the same thing. And that's not true. You can take steps to avoid it. You can make efforts to not be inconsistent and apply things, selectively.
But how, when you have such a big audience and so many people sending, and I'm not trying to, I'm just being like devil's advocate here.
No.
And I honestly, you listen to more of their content than I do.
Yes. Times two speed. Times two speed.
Right, times two speed. Right. Yeah, you listen to the times two speed. Okay, I do have questions about that. But how do you take steps when you have so much coming at you? Isn't it easier to just be like, no, they're all wrong, I'm fine, as opposed to like,
sure,
like, because you could totally like, oh, they're all right, I am all wrong, like, as opposed to like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to like really filter, well, maybe what this person said, maybe like, or how do you choose? How do they get the proper criticism?
I mean, that's a very good point, right? And there's obviously, I mean, there's this concept, right, of audience capture, where people get feedback for, positive reinforcement for some certain kinds of message, and then they, whether they know it or not, they, do it more. We all do that, I think, to some extent, but it can be more extreme, like in the case of Ruben or something, right? Mm-hmm. Whether that reflects his underlying views or not, it's clear that he's pandering to, a certain worldview.
Right.
But, and I think you're right that like there's always going to be this flood of criticism when you reach a certain level of popularity. People will hate you, just because you don't share their specific view of politics. That will always happen. So if you're as famous as Sam Harris, and I mean, like, he's famous to a certain extent, but he's certainly famous enough that he has people that just hate him.
Yeah, and just send the politics. Here's why you're bad always. Yeah.
Yes, and I mean, they have reasons for that, but like, I think in certain respects, a lot of it doesn't mean that all the criticisms of him are in good faith or correct. So if you have that kind of wave coming at you, I of course get that makes you defensive, and it makes you, searching out people who are charitable to you. Of course, that's like a natural reaction. But what? So let's take Sam Harris, because I'm kind of familiar with him, right? And if you look at his Reddit, for example, I mean, people would say it was took over at some point, but like it's highly critical of his content, and it's maybe. I mean, he's talked about it being like a forum dedicated to hating him, but from my reading, that's not what happened. There are people that hate him on there, but there's a lot of people that liked his early content, or liked him at a certain stage in their life, and then they followed him. And as it's gone on, they've become critical of him because of all of the points that people point out about, tribalism and all these kind of things, and downplaying the roles of white nationalism, but being very, very clear that we should be concerned about, extremism in Islam. But I think it's not going to be a pleasant thing to see, and there's no way that you're going to be perfect at it. But when you have this like feedback loops where you can see there's like these critiques, and I think there's a way where you can see a critique where the person hates you, and they're never going to say that anything you do is right. And then you can see a critique where the person just disagrees fundamentally with what you're doing and lays out the points and makes it clear, or they keep highlighting your hypocrisy. And it's not a matter about being respectful. Some people, the way they communicate is harsher and some less so. It's more in how well argued the content is. And I see lots of people making very well argued criticism of Sam.
Okay.
And his reaction is usually to file it into the group that hate him, that unreasonably hate him and demonize him, and unless the disagreement is minor. So if it's something where somebody basically likes him interpersonally, or agrees with him about a lot of things, then he can accept some degree of good faith criticism. But when it comes from people that hold like strongly divergent views, he just seems to immediately assume that it's, you know, motivated by and personal animus and like uncharitable takes.
Okay.
And in the case with me and lots of the people I speak to, I see them assume that I hate them, you know, that they think, oh, you just want to make me look stupid, or, you know, you personally have a vendetta against me. And it's not the case.
Right.
It's the content that they're putting out. In many cases, I'm sure they're very nice people, you know, interpersonally.
Right.
If I talk to them, I'm sure we would get on. So yeah, that's a very long-winded answer to.
No, I like it. No. And you've said some positive stuff about Sam even recently. Like I've seen you say positive stuff about him. So it's not that you kind of just call a spade a spade. Like it feels like like depending on who, like you're like, oh, this one week it's some good points from this one, and maybe some not so good points from this one. So that does lead me to my next question. Why do you dedicate you know this is coming, the amount of time?
Yeah.
And even on *2, even if you listen to it on the podcast *2, like speeding up for their voices, why do you put that amount of time into listening to these guys' podcasts and then just be critical of them? And again, not always, but often you're critiquing what they're saying.
Yeah. That's a perfectly legitimate point. And there has to be an element of like deep personality flaw and self-masochism involved. But I'm sure that's like somewhere in the mix. Maybe that's, you know, the Catholic penitent in me.
I'm gonna get a little Catholic jokes in here. Okay.
This is my, no, I left Catholicism, but I can't leave.
But you can't really like leave it forever in your
my scourging myself. But that's not fair to them. It's not that painful often. But so okay, this is me interpreting my own motivations. So like there's a lot of self-serving biases and stuff there. But generally speaking, this isn't a new thing for me. Okay. So back before the intellectual dark web was, you know, a thought in Eric Weinstein's mind, and like Barry Weiss was putting pen to paper. for I guess since my mid-teens, I like I said, interested in skepticism and that kind of thing. I consumed a lot of content from psi advocates, alternative medicine advocates, global warming denial people, as lots of people on the internet, you know, did like engaged in those debates on forums and that kind of thing. But I was always interested in the psychology of those people and those communities, because it often seemed to me that they're not all just, you know, evil, bad people or that kind of thing. Everybody thinks they're doing, you know, good. There's exceptions, but like generally speaking, people have positive self-images of themselves. And I was interested in what is the reasoning that leads to these conclusions, or, you know, how is it that they can think that HIV doesn't cause AIDS and promote that when it's going to cause, you know, when it demonstrably can cause massive harm, like anti-vaccine children, and understanding that psychology remains extremely interesting to me. And I can find blogs from, you know, like 13 years ago where I listening to a sci podcast and giving feedback like that on a blog randomly. So Twitter to me is just a different outlet for that kind of activity that I was already doing. And I think the cliche way of saying it is I like to understand, you know, the people that I disagree with and their worldviews. But it is true, and I also think it's valuable for kind of keeping critical thinking sharp, especially if you have some degree of sympathy with people's views. I mean, I don't have that for like HIV and AIDS denialism or
Okay.
this kind of, but I do have critiques of, the kind of extreme left and like liberal dogmas such as they exist. Like, so in many respects, the Quillette or intellectual dark web could appeal to me if they did what they say they do. And
Okay.
the fact that they do what they're marketing makes it interesting to me, because I would potentially be a sympathetic audience, but instead I just find it, well, as you note, like worthy of criticism. So yeah,
Yeah.
that, and that's it. So it isn't a new thing, and uh, to some to some extent, it's like Twitter in a way is therapeutic. Not in many ways. It's very maddening, and like you can get caught up in outrage cycles. But in my case, I often feel, okay, I listen to this, I have some thoughts, I'd like to get them out of me, and then
Move
that's
on.
it. And
Yeah.
of course, the better thing is to write articles and that, but I can Twitter when I'm commuting, and I can't write an article on the train. I have other articles to write, so
Yeah.
it's like that. It's kind of a like it serves a purpose of kind of letting me get some ideas out of my head, and it isn't a new thing for me.
Okay.
So yeah.
Well, in a way, you wouldn't listen if you didn't care, about the things being said. And you're not like an
Yes.
enemy of the IDW here or anything. You're just, like you said, you would be for their cause if they did what they said they would do. It's just, I feel like it's, when the whole Nietzschean quote about like you stare into the abyss and then it kind of stares into you. Like,
Yeah.
like you say, and again, I'm not even saying that any one individual of the, I am going to do a generalization about that space of people. You're like, I want to do better, and you can trust me, and I will do it right, and follow me, and like, follow us, and we will be kind dictators. Not really, like they're not dictators, but right, like they are like, no, we can do it, but then they miss, and they end up doing the things that like little onlookers like us, like looking up, we're like, oh, but I think maybe you're doing the thing that you kind of said you wouldn't, and got annoyed at that person for doing it. That's kind of what I'm getting from you.
Yeah, and I mean, like it's definitely that, like an unkind way of saying it would be hypocrisy to do the thing which you're criticizing others of doing, but there's like a certain element of it which is just a deep frustration with like people presenting that they are being revolutionary and kind of deeply critical when they're not, and like what they're so like recently with Eric Weinstein, he very much presents himself as kind of a revolutionary thinker who's trying to solve problems, but to me it sounds exactly the same as conspiracy theorists I've heard for 20 years. It's just like a slightly different spin on it, and he's good in amongst that category, but it isn't some new revolutionary like approach to things. I mean, it's basically talking about the Illuminati almost, and but people wouldn't like that because no, it's the distributed idea suppression complex.
I honestly don't understand most of Eric's tweets, so I just kind of scroll past. So I don't. I kind of am. I came from a space where I saw the IDW first through Jordan Peterson and the ideas, like the kind of more ideas space versus the politically controversial space. Like I caught the YouTube videos of his lectures, you know, and then found these other intellectuals also saying some cool, interesting things. And then, I joined Twitter and like, I started my YouTube channel, you know? So there's all these things where I kind of started off in one space and I really like looked up to these people and now I feel like it's just more healthy of like, oh yeah, they're people. Like they're just people. But I haven't super like kept up with a lot of the ideas. Like unless it really like falls in my space where I'm like, I definitely have an opinion about that. Like when Brett was talking about like Christians, can you please get rid of your, beliefs in Jesus and the magic of Jesus and I that was more like a really just that's not what it is, and like me and my cohorts we're like I'm part of this group called Bridges of Meaning on on Discord, and it was funny the little side conversations going on there that was also going on Twitter, but like but I know nothing against the guy. I still am fine. Please come on my podcast and we can discuss this, Eric. Or I mean, Brett. but I just was like, no, like that's actually not like but he got way more hate than I know. I was pretty nice. I was like, actually that's not what we think, but then people were like, how dare you? But like he was really, certain people who follow him are like, that is sacred, don't you dare, But he listened. Actually he actually listened. He didn't say, I agree with you, but he's like, I've learned a lot. And you don't get that a lot from them, from that group. So I feel like that one was like a situation where maybe did you see that bit? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I didn't see that. I think the position that you describe of like having healthy levels of skepticism towards the people is the appropriate response.
I was like, I agree with that. I don't agree with that. Like, I still like you. Like, I still like all of them, like as people. And you can kind of just be like, like, I don't agree, but I don't always write only stuff that I'm like, I really got to write something there. But like, I mean, I'm not listening to other podcasts at 2 times speed like you are. So
you can like people and be critical of them.
Totally.
I mean, it's hard, of course, because people don't react very well to criticism for understandable reasons. But but I still think, you can generally respect people and like be critical when they deserve it. But in the specific case with Brett and like talking about, Christianity and that kind of thing. So the weird thing with Brett is that he, part of the reason I even started paying attention to Eric's content was because I noticed Brett talking about evolution, and that's an area I have an interest in. And he often links his kind of ideas to religion, right, as a evolutionary system.
Right. And yes, I remember that. Yeah.
Yes, and I'm active in a field called the cognitive science of religion, which is where a lot of that work goes on. And like with Brett, it feels a bit like Uncanny Valley, where, he's saying things which sort of sound like normal things within that field, but then he just adds in these kind of like extra bits, which are highly speculative or like completely crazy. And then like group selection for the Nazis and like the Jewish phenotype and all that. Like,
I didn't see that.
When he was on stage talking about that with the German phenotype or tribes, I can't remember how he worded it, but you could see Richard Dawkins' eyes almost pop out of his head. And Dawkins is not someone who thinks that we shouldn't apply an evolutionary framework, but he was kind of like, "What the are you talking about?" And I find in the same way with Brett and Jordan Peterson and Eric that, and maybe other parts of the intellectual dark web to different degrees, but they have these bits which are fine, where they describe some theory that exists and they relate it to something, sometimes unnecessarily, but they're describing a theory which exists, but then they push into that something which is like super speculative or which is their ideology, and it's mixed in as if it's equally as well established as the established thing. And that to me harmful, because people end up with this kind of mishmash of, they've got these ideas which are completely legitimate, but they've got it filtered along with like Jordan Peterson's worldview or Brett's like unique take on evolutionary systems. And those people should be aware. I mean, to some extent, they very much enjoy presenting themselves as unorthodox thinkers, but it should be clear that that's unorthodox in some of the same ways that, you know, conspiracy theories are unorthodox, or like alternative medicine is unorthodox. It isn't just that there's it's just a, you know, a debate within the field. No, there was a piece on Jordan Peterson specifically written by one of his mentors. I don't know if you ever seen that.
The guy who hired. I felt really bad for Jordan, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, that would be personally very hard to hear, right? Because, I mean, he was at his house and it seemed like but one part of that critique that like stuck with me was that lecturer, that person who mentored him, went to watch his class, and he critiqued that it was this inspiring, very, you know, interesting, very stimulating, not like a normal lecture, but he mixed in these like his own personal thoughts and things which are, you know, the stuff he gets criticized for, like DNA being represented in ancient images, or alongside stuff which is legitimate, and it was all mixed together. And
but the ancient, you know, civilization of Atlantis could have known about DNA. Come on, no. I actually no, who knows? Okay, yes, you're saying.
But no, the only thing is, like, for me, people would say, well, people often seem to say, well, that's just, you know, that's just a random like coincidence that Jordan Peterson is almost talking about ancient aliens and like who built the pyramid stuff. But to me, it isn't this random coincidence. It's the reason that there's overlap is because the way that they approach research and evidence and conspiracies is similar, and it has the same sorts of problems. So other people think there's like it's cherry picking superficial comparisons, but for me, it's a fundamental problem with the ideology, and that's why maybe when Brett says something which on its own is just, you know, okay, maybe he was being speculative and he didn't mean, but when you put it together with the things that he, you know, says over time, it becomes less defensible because it feels like he isn't updating his, you know, like in the statistical terms, his Bayesian framework remains kind of that he doesn't predict well what's going to cause outrage or how speculative certain ideas are. And I mean, you see that in the way that they're quite certain that the Weinstein brothers, at least, are quite certain that they deserve Nobel Prizes. That's insane. You won't hear that from, you know, normal researchers without like very good reason, and yet they're very clear that their research is Nobel Prize worthy. That's a problem, you know, in thinking.
It almost seems like if only there was a kind of asterisk that they would put up, you know, to be like, these are my thoughts, by the way. I wonder if it was presented like, so the research or the data or the running theory is this. However, I have some ideas here. This is me talking, not the research. Like, if they made it a very, very clear distinction, would that make a difference for you?
It would be better, but it's. I mean, I think that would be like a massive step forward, but it's still, the issue is usually in the reasoning that they get. I mean, I'm fine. I'm actually completely fine. And this is something that comes up on Twitter often, that people seem to mistake when I'm criticizing something, that I'm saying people can't say that. People can say whatever they want or believe whatever they want, but then people can criticize them for it. That's my position. So, you know, people being free to speculate about, you know, the elites that are controlling society and preventing like Eric and Brett from getting Nobel Prizes, fine for them to speculate about that. But they deserve criticism for that. And if they put the ideas out there, they will receive it and should expect it. And it doesn't mean that, you know, you're being suppressed or whatever. It's just if you say crazy things or, you know, very extreme things, that people will push back. And
Right.
that seems to me like a healthy, normal thing to happen.
And
And
in
not
some
worthy
cases,
of.
they adjust a little, depending. Like I said, like Brett adjusted with the whole Jesus
Yes,
magic thing. Like he did. Um,
he did. But in that case, like you talked about earlier, that can also lead to audience capture, right? Because
right.
if Brett got an audience, which I would say he has, that has, you know, a significant right skew and might be more or more religious than, you know, say if it was liberal atheist audience,
Or even Sam
then
Harris's audience or whatever.
yes, although, you know, the same problem emerged there because when he found out he had like a significant portion of Trump supporters, he couldn't
Oh.
understand
Oh.
why.
Oh, then
But
okay, I
it's
guess I'm making assumptions then. Okay.
but no, I mean it's a perfectly reasonable assumption that like one of the most well-known atheists would have a significant following of atheists.
Yeah.
But I don't know how he feels to miss, you know, his popularity amongst the like right, at least center right, and that speaks to a certain like lack of awareness about, you know, what other people can see quite clearly.
Right.
So Brett modulating his opinion, like I maybe I'm being a bit contradictory here,
Okay.
but you know, aren't we all? The it, it I think it is a good thing when people modulate opinions or, you know, take criticism on board. Like Majid Nawaz retweeted someone, and it turns out the guy might have, well, seems to be in a picture with a guy doing a Nazi salute, and I think there's good reason that he's like a far right guy. So he took the picture away.
Okay.
You know, you can talk about maybe he should have done that before he tweeted it, but at least he did, you know, afterwards he was like, okay, I'm going to take it away because this guy, I need to check into him.
Mm.
But I think that you do deserve some recognition for, you know, like, okay, I'll do something in response to criticism.
Right.
But that also comes with like what we talked about earlier, that you have to separate like reactionary outrage from these aren't people making legitimate points. And I think people did have legitimate points in the case of Brett. So it was good that he modulated it, but it isn't the case that that's always the way it should go. You know, if Rubin tweeted out something that was critical of, I mean, he won't, but if he tweeted out something that was critical of Trump, he would get pounced on by his
You're right,
audience.
because of his also that's what the whole audience capture thing. Yeah. That's hard to know. Like, oh, see, they changed. You're like, no, their audience just got mad at them. So that's where I guess you almost have to do. I've seen some of them, some say this, where it's like, oh, they're both sides are mad at me, the right and the left.
Yeah.
You and I, we're little people. We don't know. Like, I mean, I feel like, oh man, they need to change and this, but it's hard when you are that big. I mean, that big to me. Like, I mean, and I know they're not like
no.
in the millions.
I completely agree, and I have no like delusions of grandeur about how, you know, how niche my position and interests are in the online space. Like, I think I have a healthy level of self-awareness of, you know, how niche my interests are. But what I think with like people that have, you know, 250,000 followers, over 1 million followers, that what happens there is your responsibility becomes more, not less. And
okay, I see what you mean. Yeah.
In the case of like, say, Sam, I mean, again, he's just an easy person because I consume a lot of his content, but he had this point where he mentioned on a couple of podcasts that about Stefan Molyneux, right? And he generally, when he mentioned him, he would say, you know, people are asking me to have him on. I don't really know. I haven't done any research into him. I hear some bad things, but I hear bad things about me, so maybe it's not fair. And he brought this up over the course of 2 years, or maybe longer, on various podcasts, saying, kind of thinking back and forth about this guy, and kind of not endorsing in any way, but also, saying, look, I don't know what this guy, and like maybe there's like reasons for the criticism. Now, some people would look at that and say, well, look, he's been responsible. He didn't invite him on for like being a guest, and like set aside all the stuff that happened with Christian Pitcalucci and editing the podcast, all that before that. But the bit that always gets me with like Sam, and it's a common thing, is why didn't he have an opinion after years of, and this guy being the second most requested, he said at one point, this is the second most requested guest after Jordan Peterson. And like, why didn't he spend, an evening or a couple of evenings, watch some of his content, read some of the critiques of him, and look into him? And of course, these people are busy. They have books to write, they have podcasts to write, and so on. But years, we're talking years, and not having opinion. And that strikes me as like irresponsible, or at the very, and a clear example is Sam had several podcasts where he discussed the content and the meaning of the Christchurch shooters manifesto, and like what it signals about, but he continuously said, well, I haven't read it, but I think it's like this. And it was months later, and he was, he was kind of like debating with the historian, that Kathleen something Bigelow maybe, but discussing about what it means. And he was saying, well, but we can't really tell because there's shit posting content, and like the guy obviously wasn't radicalized by Candace Owens, but Sam hadn't took, the hour or like 40 minutes it would take to read that document. And if you read that document, it's not ambiguous what the ideology is. Yes, there's some things about like eco-fascism and stuff, but it's obviously hardcore white nationalism. The title is Replacement. So it's this like lack of research, or willingness to venture an opinion, but not willingness to put in the effort to kind of back up that opinion, and then retreating to, well, I'm just giving uncomfortable ideas, and like I'm challenging the dogma. But if you want to do that, you have to put in the work to say like, oh, I've done the research on this and I disagree because of this. But I was like, in that case, Sam talks about terrorism a lot, and at that point he was talking about white nationalism frequently because he was being criticized for not covering it. So it just bewilders me that you wouldn't spend time to read a manifesto, but you will venture public opinions on it, and it seems, like I said, irresponsible.
With great power comes great responsibility, I suppose, is the takeaway from this.
Right.
So, okay, I think this is a good space to wrap up.
Sure.
Wrap up. So, do you have any like papers or any, I don't know, books or anything you'd like to promote? Your Twitter account?
My Google Scholar has my publications, but
okay.
Yeah, I have just overdue publications and books that I need to write. So this is why, the critique of the intellectual dark web is my like escape from when I'm need a break from writing, which is like my actual work. So your suggestion to connect them is why I was like, oh no.
Oh like, right, you're like no, they're very separate in my mind.
Separate to some extent, but there are connections. So yeah, I don't have anything clearly to pimp. I have a Twitter account.
Oh yeah, I'll link it then. Yeah, well, I really, like I said, your critiques are very fair-minded, and again, people could, like, they're fair in the sense that people could still disagree with them or agree, but you're not attacking. You're like, oh, here's why I don't think this is actually the case. I hear some
I
things to back them up. So
Yes, I mean, I think I generally, of course, I'll accept, the praise, but I would say that like they certainly feel that it's attacking, and
right.
there is a sense in which my criticism is pretty harsh often, and like I think justly so, but I certainly understand why they see it as,
Right. So you get
attacking.
it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's good as long as
Yeah,
you're self-aware. That's all we're asking for them as well as us being self-aware. So,
yeah,
well, thanks so much for
yes.
chatting, Chris. I so appreciate the time you gave me today. So, thanks for that for coming on.
No problem. It was fun.